watching Our Time on Freedom in the studio. Mikhail Barano, hello. Last night, the Dnipropetrovsk region came under Russian attack. A man was killed in the Kryvyi Rih district as a result of a strike by an FPV drone. In Nikopol, 2 more people were injured. Infrastructure, businesses, power lines, and vehicles were also damaged there. A private house caught fire, and rescuers extinguished the blaze. More than 30 settlements came under fire in the Kherson region. The Russian army used aerial bombs and artillery for the attack. They targeted critical and social infrastructure. More than a dozen private homes and cell towers were damaged. 9 people were injured in the region. Another resident was wounded in Kherson itself. There, as a result of the morning shelling in the Korabelny district, apartment buildings, a supermarket, and a car were damaged. 2 people were killed due to an attack by the Russian army on the Sumy region. Over the past day, Russian forces carried out at least 30 strikes on the region. 20 settlements came under fire, according to local authorities. The highest number of explosions was recorded in the Sumy and Shaska districts. Private homes, civilian infrastructure, and vehicles were damaged. Residents of Sumy were left without water and partially without electricity. This was also due to the overnight Russian attacks. There are also power supply problems in the Mykolaiv and Kharkiv regions. The General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces recorded 177 combat engagements on the front line over the past day. In the Huliai Pole direction, defense forces repelled 14 enemy attacks and 16 in the Lyman direction. Another 17 Russian assaults were stopped in the Alexandrovka sector and 22 in the Kostiantinovka sector of the front. The hottest spot remains the Pokrovsk area. There, Russian occupiers stormed the positions of Ukrainian defenders 48 times. Special operations forces in Donetsk region eliminated a Russian sabotage and reconnaissance group. They tried to slip into the rear of the Ukrainian defenders, taking advantage of the weather conditions. According to the Special Operations Forces, operators from the 8th Regiment set up an ambush for the Russian sabotage and reconnaissance group while carrying out a special mission in a wooded area. As a result, the entire enemy group, 5 soldiers, was eliminated. Drone operators from the Unmanned Systems Forces inflicted further critical losses on the enemy within their unit's area of responsibility. The Unmanned Systems Forces destroyed 2 Tor-M1 self-propelled anti-aircraft missile systems, as well as 1 new Buk M3 air defense system belonging to the Russian army. Destroying such systems is highly significant, since the Russian army faces a severe shortage in the production of high-tech and expensive air defense systems, and relies on them to make up for its losses. Over the past day, Ukraine's defense forces have eliminated 1,010 Russian occupiers. Thus, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the total losses of the Russian army since the start of the full-scale war have exceeded 1,183,000 military personnel. In addition, yesterday, Ukrainian defenders destroyed 1 tank, 1 armored combat vehicle, 25 artillery systems, and 107 units of enemy automotive equipment. A vessel from Russia's Shadow Fleet has been seized in the port of Odessa. This was reported by the Security Service of Ukraine. Previously, the ship had illegally transported Ukrainian agricultural products from temporarily occupied Crimea. The Russian-controlled vessel, sailing under the flag of one of the African countries, was exposed when it arrived at the port of Odessa to export a shipment of steel pipes. Its owner is under sanctions by the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine. To circumvent the restrictions, the ship regularly changed its name and listed beneficiaries from third countries, according to the Security Service of Ukraine. At the time of the vessel's detention, the captain and 16 crew members were on board. All of them are citizens of Middle Eastern countries. EU Commissioner for Enlargement Marta Koss has arrived in Ukraine for a 2-day visit. According to the European Commission, she will discuss the country's accession to the EU at an informal meeting of European Union ministers. And on Thursday, December 11th, in Lviv, the European Commissioner will join the informal General Affairs Council. There, together with Ukrainian and European officials, she will discuss the progress of negotiations on Ukraine's membership in the European Union. Germany is developing plans to prepare its airspace in case the country needs to defend itself. In particular, work is underway with the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Transport to be ready for defense. Arndt Schoenemann, the head of the company that controls Germany's airspace, told Euronews about this. According to him, airlines and airports still do not take the possibility of such a scenario seriously enough. Let me remind you, German authorities have repeatedly warned about the increase in the number of hybrid attacks, especially drone incursions, which pose a security threat. The European Union notes that there is insufficient pressure on Russia during discussions of a possible peaceful resolution to the war in Ukraine. This was stated by the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Kaja Kallas. According to her, there is a risk that with weak pressure, a peace agreement could actually reward the aggressor. She emphasized that the current format of the discussion does not create sufficient incentives for Russia to end the war on fair terms.
We see agreements and discussions between Ukraine and the United States, as well as between the United States and Russia. What we also clearly see is that there is not much pressure being put on Russia. We can't end up in a situation where a peace agreement effectively rewards aggression, because then we will see more of this kind of thing. The EU has put forward a number of conditions that are for it. Red lines. Respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the Ukrainian people, as well as the return of Ukrainian children. And we have all these points. I think it's important that we continue to raise these issues when it comes to putting pressure on Russia. Putin is trying to portray
the Russian economy as capable of sustaining a prolonged war against Ukraine. He wants to convince the West that Russia's victory is inevitable, analysts from the American Institute for the Study of War explain. The Kremlin is mocking diplomacy and ramping up strikes on Ukraine, said European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. But according to her, the European Union has both the means and the will to increase pressure on Russia and force it to begin real negotiations for peace. Yulia Agranovskaya will continue on this topic.
Putin is expecting not less, but more war, writes Sky News. Moscow's statements about seeking a peaceful resolution do not match the aggressor's actual actions. The Russian army has not only failed to stop shelling peaceful Ukrainian cities, but on the contrary has intensified terrorist attacks on the country's civilian and critical infrastructure. Russia is putting forward impossible conditions for ending the war, precisely because it is interested in the war continuing, analysts explain. However, the Kremlin's goal is not just to buy time, but also to try to convince the United States that increasing sanctions pressure will not have the desired effect on the Russian economy. And it won't force Putin to make compromises to end the war against Ukraine.
Putin is trying to portray the Russian economy as capable of sustaining a prolonged war against Ukraine, which likely supports the ongoing Russian cognitive warfare, falsely claiming that Russia's victory is inevitable. The Kremlin is trying to link its statements about the Russian economy to the false narrative of Russia's inevitable victory on the battlefield. Both narratives are aimed at forcing the West and Ukraine to capitulate to Russia's demands and fear, ahead of Russia's reinforcements and prolonged military operations in the future, according to a report from the Institute for the Study of War.
The longer Putin wages war against Ukraine, the higher the costs will be for Russia, according to European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. The European Union has no intention of easing sanctions pressure on Moscow. On the contrary, since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Brussels has adopted 19 sanctions packages against the aggressor and is working on the 20th. In this new era, geoeconomics goes hand in hand with geopolitics. We know how painful an impact our sanctions have on Russia's war economy. Together with our allies, Europe has both the means and the will to increase pressure on Russia, forcing it to come to the negotiating table. Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, on the European Commission's website. Further support for Ukraine and increasing economic pressure on the aggressor country became key topics in the Ukrainian president's talks with the leaders of the United Kingdom, Germany, and France in London.
We support Ukraine. If a ceasefire is reached, it must be fair and long-lasting. That is why it is so important to constantly remember that decisions regarding Ukraine are made only with Ukraine. We are ready to support you in both the fight and the negotiations, and to ensure a fair and lasting settlement if we are able to achieve this goal. In
the context of working on the peace plan, the issue of providing Ukraine with a reparations loan using frozen Russian assets is becoming increasingly relevant.
We are counting on this money. We are counting on the tranche. I don't know if this will be a reparations payment or if it'll be an alternative. It all depends on Europe's unity, on the convictions and opinions of some skeptics who still remain. Volodymyr Zelenskyy, president of Ukraine.
The governments of Estonia, Finland, Ireland, Latvia, Poland, Sweden, and Lithuania sent a letter to the head of the European Commission and the president of the European Council, emphasizing that the implementation of the reparations loan would strengthen Ukraine's position in negotiations. The European Union is close to reaching an agreement on using frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine, according to the Office of the British Prime Minister, following talks between the leaders of the United Kingdom, Ukraine, Germany, and France. According to sources from Bloomberg, an agreement on the use of frozen Russian assets could be reached before Christmas.
Subscribe to The Gaze and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.